Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I hope you all are doing absolutely well. So guys, in today's video, we are going to understand what is data binding in Angular. So in the previous videos, we have already seen a lot of topics. So if you haven't checked my previous videos yet, please make sure to do so. And if you are new to the channel, make sure to subscribe to the channel too. Also, I'm creating a complete playlist on Angular where we have already discussed a lot of topics. Make sure to check them too. Let's start with our today's topic, that is what is data binding. So in Angular, basically, in order to understand data binding, we have to understand these four topics, that is what is string interpolation, what is property binding, what is event binding, and what is two-way data binding, because all these are different types of data binding that we can perform in Angular. Okay, basically let us understand what is data binding. So data binding is nothing but a way of sending data from one file to another file. Okay, because you know what happens is in our Angular application we have a component file and then we have a template file or our HTML file. So if we have to send some data from our component to our HTML file, then this is only what is called as data binding or passing the data. So now this data binding or passing the data can happen in different ways. So for that only we have different types of binding. First of all, let us see the definition of data binding. So it's the automatic synchronization of data between the model and the view components. So when I say model, I mean component files, and view components means our DOM file or our HTML file. So it's the automatic synchronization of data between the model and the view components in your Angular application. This means that when the data in your model changes, the corresponding view updates automatically and vice versa. So what we are saying is whenever we change any data in our component file, the view updates automatically according to the updated value of our data in our component file. So let us understand one by one what are different kinds of bindings that we have. First of all, let us see string interpolation. So this diagram is very important because this diagram explains us how data binding happens in different cases. So in the first example, if you see, so with this string interpolation, we can send the data from our component to our DOM. Okay, so what we do is we create a variable in our component and then we pass that variable to our DOM file, and in this way we pass our data from component file to our DOM. The next example is of our property binding. So in property binding, what happens is, so if you remember in our HTML, we have different elements like button, h1 and different elements. So all those elements have some attributes. Okay, for example, a button have a disabled attribute. So that is only called as property. So if we want to update the property, okay, of any element in HTML, then we use this property binding. Okay, we are going to see that in a minute using the example, then you will understand in a better way. Next that we have is event binding. Okay, so in event binding, what happens is, so till now in the first two example you have seen, we were binding the data or passing the data from our component to our DOM file. Okay, but what we do is in event binding, we pass the data from our DOM to our component. Basically we do some action on our DOM or our front end. So using that, the data changes in our component file. So that is what is called as event binding. We are going to see the examples for all of them in a minute. And last one is the most important one, that is two-way data binding. And this is the syntax for writing two-way data binding. So in two-way data binding, what happens is we can update the value from our component file to our DOM, and we can do the vice versa of it. That is, we can even update the value from our DOM to component file. Event binding is generally called as a combination of property binding and event binding. Why? Because property binding is only giving us the option to pass data from component to DOM, and event binding is only giving us the option to pass data from DOM to component. But two-way data binding is the combination of both, that is property binding and event binding. So we have understood a lot of things about data binding. Let us now go to our code editor and let's see all this in practical. So if you see, I am in my app.component.html file, and here I have just written a basic h1 line. Okay, and let's see our app on screen, and if you see, data binding is getting displayed on my screen. First of all, let us understand what is string interpolation. So string interpolation, for that what I am going to do is I am going to create a new variable called as username. Okay, and here I am going to pass it a value. For example, I am going to pass it my name, so that is Rahul, and I am going to save it. Now I am going to go back to my HTML file, and here I am going to display that. So I want to display that value in a paragraph. So for that I am using paragraph tag, and inside that I am using interpolation. So we have already seen that for interpolation we have this syntax where we have to use two curly braces, and inside that we are going to pass our variable name. So I'm passing username. So if you see on my screen, I can see my name, that is Rahul. Okay, so this is only what is called as interpolation. So in interpolation, what we do is we pass our data from our component file to our HTML file, right? So that is what we are doing. We are declaring our variable in our component file, and then we are passing that data into our HTML file. Now let's see what is property binding. So in order to understand property binding, what I'm doing is I'm taking an input. There are multiple properties that are attached to all the HTML elements that we have. For example, one such property that an input element has is disabled. By default, this disabled value is always false. So if you create a input on the screen, let me remove this first and let's save and see. So if you see, by default the input value is enabled. Okay, I can type anything in it, but I want that this should be disabled. So for that, what I can do is I can do this way, disabled, and then I can pass a value to it. For that, what I need to do is I can create a variable here that is disabled. Okay, and then I'm going to pass it a value of true. Once this is done, I'm going to save it and I'm going to pass this is disabled value to my property. So if you see, now my input value is disabled. So I can't type anything and my input field is only disabled. So in this way, property binding works. So in property binding, we have this syntax that the property value we display it inside our square brackets and then the value to our property. Okay, again in property binding, we have seen how the data is getting passed. Data is getting passed from our component to our DOM. Okay, so in both this example, that is string interpolation and property binding, the data is getting passed from component to DOM. Now let us see the third example where what we will see, from our DOM we will pass the data to component, or we will update the component value. For that, what we have event binding. So in order to understand event binding, let's take an example. So I have this button, I have created this button, and let's take update input. Okay, so I have given a name to the button. So if you see, I am getting this button over here. Now what I want is, so there are different events also that are assigned or attached to every element in HTML. For example, one such event is onClick event, but onClick is the name of the event that we have in HTML, but in Angular we have the event name as click. Okay, now I want that this value should be changed from true to false, but I don't want that this value should be changed from here in this component file, but I want that this value should be changed when I click on this button. So for that, what we will do is, whenever I click on this button, my is disabled will become false. So as soon as my is disabled will become false, my input will become active. So if you see, this is happening. So this is only what is called as event binding. So if I'll refresh again, initially, if you see, my input is disabled, but when I am clicking on update input, from here, that is from my DOM, I am changing the value of my variable that is present in our component file, that is disabled. So this is only what is event binding. So event binding, what it does is we can update our or pass data from our DOM to component, and that is what we are doing. From our DOM we are changing the value of is disabled, and that is getting updated. Okay, now final thing is two-way data binding. So let's see two-way data binding. Now two-way data binding is a very important concept, because two-way data binding is one of the features that we have in Angular. Okay, for now what I will do is I am going to comment this line that I have in the input previously, and I have just copied and pasted the same input over here. We are going to update this input so that we can perform two-way data binding. Now in order to do two-way data binding, we have a basic syntax. So here only you can see we have something called as ng model. Okay, so we can use this ng model and we can perform two-way data binding. So the syntax that I can write over here is in this way. I need to write square brackets, and then inside this we have these brackets, and here I have to write ng model. Okay, and here I can pass username. So what this will do basically is this will fill my input with the username value, and in the username we have given our value as Rahul. Okay, so basically my username will be pre-filled with Rahul. Okay, and then whenever we update any value, that value will update on the fly and will display in this our paragraph. But if you see on my screen, I am getting one error that can't bind to ng models since it isn't a known property of input. Now this is very important that whenever we are using ng model, we have to import it first of all. So currently we are in the latest version of React. So what we need to do is we need to go to our app.component file. So here we need to import our forms module. Okay, so how can I import it? So here directly I need to mention my forms module. Now if you are in your previous versions of Angular, you need to do the same thing in your module file. Okay, so let's see. So now if you see, our error is gone. Now what we are getting is I'm getting this input. Okay, and you can see the input is pre-filled with our username value, and if I click on update input, my input will get enabled, and here whatever I'm typing over here, if you see, that is getting updated in our username. And this is only what is two-way data binding. Basically what I'm doing is I am updating my input value, okay, on the DOM, and with which my username that is present in my component file is getting updated. Okay, and this is what is two-way data binding, and this is very important feature in our Angular. So in this video we have seen different kinds of data binding. First of all, we have seen what is string interpolation. That is, string interpolation was helping us to pass data from our component to our DOM. Then we have seen what is property binding. With property binding, what we were doing is we were updating the property of any element in our HTML. And in that also we were passing the data from our component to our DOM. Next is event binding. So with event binding, what we used to do is we were having some event, that is one event that we have seen is click event. With that, what we were doing is we were updating the value or passing the data from our DOM to our component file. And finally, we have seen two-way data binding, with which what happens is, first of all, we are passing the value, that is username, from our component to our DOM, and then later on whenever we are updating any value in the DOM, that is getting updated in our component also. So this is what two-way data binding, that is data is getting passed from both the places, that is from component to DOM and from DOM to component. So in this way we have seen all different kinds of data binding in one single video. If I want, I could have created single videos on every topic, but I want to provide you all the knowledge in one video only, and that too, you can interrelate all those topics. So now it is very important for you guys to practice all these topics that we have seen in this video. For that, what I will do is I will create my next video on exercise of data binding. In that video, what we will do is we will perform an exercise which will improve our knowledge of data binding. Okay, so and it will make our concepts stronger. So with this video, we have completely understood what is data binding in Angular. So that's all for this video. Again, if you are new to the channel, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching the video.